Today we are with Jay Zimner, partner at Zimner Law. We had a phenomenal episode talking about a multitude of different things. Jay has a phenomenal career, over 20 years of legal experience and hundreds of millions in transactions across the legal field and litigation. We talked about some really interesting things today about buying condos and co-ops in Manhattan, some of the trends that they've seen post-COVID, and some of the changes that are kind of going on in that industry, especially in Manhattan. And also we talked a lot about the power of networking. Jay in particular has had an amazing story over his career about how he's networked into, really turned his entire career basically from networking. So really awesome episode. Hope you tune in. I hope you enjoy it. Thanks, everybody. Welcome, everybody, to episode 26 of Blueprint for Closers. I am Rob Nixon. I am joined by my co-host, Dom Ciccarelli. And we are joined today by Jay Zimner, managing partner of Zimner Law in Manhattan. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you guys for having me.
What's up, bud? How are you?
I'm great. What could be better than sitting with the two of you talking shop?
I know that you have an interesting story about once you became a lawyer, you really didn't go the traditional route of working for other law firms for a while and learning the ropes. I think you kind of just dove in, right?
I did. And as I reflect back on that, there's pros and cons to, I think, many of the decisions we make. And I guess there's really no way to know for sure whether or not the other path would have been a better path. But given my standing in school and my desire to practice law, which was next to nothing, I figured if I was going to get a job, it was going to be self-created. And so my stepfather in Arizona had come up with a somewhat interesting marketing plan to attract clients to him. He was doing matrimonial mediation in Arizona, having been in commercial real estate for many years. He got into matrimonial mediation work. And the way he was doing that was sending letters to parties in matrimonial actions that is public information in the courts. So after attending law school, graduating, and just before getting the results of the bar exam, I decided, you know what? Maybe that's something I could do as a graduate of law school, send some letters out to some defendants in some civil cases and see where it takes me. So I ran down to Supreme New York. I decided to take the Connecticut bar as well. So I went up to Stamford and Bridgeport, where there are other courthouses. And I would ask the clerk to wheel out as many cases as they could give me, civil cases, that I could then go through, find the names of the defendant, their address, the amount they were being sued for, and what they were being sued for. And I would send all of them a letter saying who I was, what I could help them with at a flat fee. And I wouldn't perpetuate the case in order to churn up legal fees. I would try to settle their cases for as little and as quickly as possible, which was appealing to people who were dealing with financial issues. Generally speaking, the people who were calling me back were those facing foreclosure or those that had credit card debt. So the people that would return my reach out through this letter were those that were facing those types of crises and were recently named in a lawsuit, and they were looking for a low-cost out. And so I would send out about 100 letters a week, and I would get maybe 8 to 10 people to respond to the letter, and I would convert about 2 or 3 of those to clients every single week. So at 25 years old, I was already booking all this business, and I barely knew what I was doing, other than I felt like I could negotiate more easily than they could because they're the bad guy trying to call other lawyers or other credit agencies, and they were getting nowhere. But as soon as a lawyer calls, the whole sort of script changes, and the dialogue changes, and there's a different level of respect. And so for that, I was able to run to the courthouse before they were defaulted, file an answer, which was probably all that I knew how to do. And once you file an answer in a civil case, it pretty much prolongs the case indefinitely in some cases until plaintiffs decide to push their case to trial. But no one wanted to try these cases. So ultimately, it opened the door for me to negotiate settlements for these people. And that's when my life kind of changed quite dramatically, as I found myself in the middle of a major foreclosure scandal, to say the least, which I'm happy to share with your audience as well if you think they'd be interested in that story.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think Rob, we constantly see a common theme in these episodes. I mean, the guys that just jump in before they're ready, right? It's always just jump in and figure it out as you go, as opposed to if you're waiting until you're ready, you're never going to feel ready, and you're never actually going to do it. I have so many friends that are way smarter than me that have been saying for 30 years they want to invest in real estate, and guess what? They still haven't invested because they're not 100% confident. They're not sure if they have the courage to do it, and time is undefeated, and it's moving back. It's moving by very quickly. So kudos to you to just jumping in. And then talk about a niche market, right? I mean, you didn't sit back waiting for your phone to ring. You found this, little tiny, I'm not going to call it a loophole, but strategy where people are being sued all the time. Go find those people who are being sued and negotiate for them, which, it seems like a pretty simple thing. And it sounds like it worked because, listen, 2 clients a week is a lot of clients.
So I'd definitely like to hear about the foreclosure scandal. And is that what led you into real estate?
Not exactly. There's a story behind the real estate part of this. So as you could probably tell, litigation sort of happened by accident as by way of these letters that I was sending to try to help people with these lawsuits that they were faced with. And so because of that, I had to quickly learn through trial and error, no pun intended, what to do and what not to do. Whether it be in discovery or in a courtroom or with motion filing and motion practice and all the things that litigators tend to deal with on a daily basis, I was just kind of thrown in the fire with no real intention of ever fighting or dragging out the case. I just needed to find enough leverage for my client for the other side to say, okay, we get it. You're not going away. We'll negotiate with you. And all of a sudden, as I found myself dealing with these types of cases, primarily foreclosures, I started to get these phone calls that looked very random on my little flip phone at the time, back in 2006, 2005. And the numbers would come up and I didn't recognize them. They weren't client numbers. So I picked up the phone and I said, hey, this is Joe Schmo, Joe Smith, whoever. We noticed that you have a number of cases that you're defending in the foreclosure part up in Stamford and Bridgeport. Can we ask you a few questions? They said, sure. What are your questions? They said, well, actually, we have a new product where we loan people in your client's situation with the money that they need in order to get out of the foreclosure that they're in. I said, really? Like, in my mind, internally, I'm thinking, my clients have nothing. They don't have jobs. They don't have money to pay their mortgage. That's why they're in the situation that they're in. What bank in their right mind would actually go so far as to give my clients bailout money to get out of a bad situation that could probably result in another bad situation? But I wasn't going to ask any questions. I was there to resolve people's problems, so long as I did my job as lawyer and protect them from the harms that may come, and that they have an opportunity to go to another lawyer for any other advice, which I explored with my clients. And so I don't know if the two of you will remember the movie The Big Short. It was a movie all about, okay, so you're extremely familiar with the movie. Had I been a little bit wiser, a little bit older, and a little bit more moneyed, I probably would have been a character in that movie. And the reason why I say that is my clients were being pursued through me by these what they called predatory lenders that were offering these adjustable rate mortgages. These were all concepts I had never heard of before. This was all new to me. And so I wasn't really sure about it, but I knew enough to read the fine print. And it seemed like these adjustable rate mortgages were going to put my clients right back in the place that they were today or at the time. So I said, you got to be very careful with this. And a lot of the, the know-it-alls blame the banks for being predatory. I can tell all of your listeners right now, my clients were just as greedy and just as desperate to get out of their foreclosures as the banks were to loan the money. Again, we're talking about perfect storms. My clients begged me, Jay, Mr. Zimner, whatever they were calling me at the time, please get us whatever money you can. I can't believe it. You're a savior. We'll take it. We'll deal with the problems in 7 years from now or in 5 years from now. We just want this money. Please help us get out of foreclosure. My mom is depending on it. My children depend on it. I depend on it. It's the only thing I've ever had. I moved to this country from Mexico, and I have my dream here. They're going to try to take it away from me. Please save it. So my clients were just as desperate for the money that I was able to provide to them, but it came with a lot of disclosures and a lot of self-protection because I knew that at some point this might backfire. So in fast forwarding, just to let your audience know, there was no trouble that I'm aware of. My clients never got back in touch with me years later to tell me that there was a disaster, thank God. But I did come across one moment in my career early on that drove me to the part of my career that I'm currently in, which is the money started to dry up a little bit from the institutional lenders or whatever these banks were. And I had a woman who was well educated. She was in her early 60s and she had a very good job. And she was reaching a retirement age where she would have enough money to take from the retirement fund and apply it to her home. But it was too far off for her to wait. So I had a very good friendship with my landlord here in the city. And I went to him and I said, hey, John, I have an opportunity for you. I've been doing these deals now for 2 or 3 years. You could come in, loan my client the money that she needs to pay off the principal on the current mortgage that's foreclosing. Give her 1 year to refinance and figure out a way to buy you out. And you'll have an option basically at 10%. So he would make 10% on his money for a year. And that was around 2007. So you guys probably know where this is going. My landlord friend loans my client $400,000 to pay off the bad debt. He takes a first position on the home. Her and her mother and her daughter are living in this home in Stamford. And at the end of the year, when she intended to refinance and buy out my landlord, there was no money to be had in 2008. It had all dried up. And she hadn't yet reached the retirement fund that would have allowed her to borrow against it in order to buy him out. And I begged and pleaded with my landlord, who was now an investor in this property, to not steal this woman's equity, to not then foreclose and compound the problem and put her right back in the place where she was, and you being owed another $40,000 on your money. So because of the relationship I had with him, he allowed her to spend the next year figuring things out, getting closer to that retirement, finally reaching that retirement age that then allowed her to have enough liquidity to borrow against. And she was thankfully able to buy out my client. It took 2 years to make 10% instead of 1 year. So it didn't become as appealing as an investment, but I did save my client's home. I did help my landlord make a little bit of money, and I was able to part ways from that dramatic situation and found myself really contemplating what the hell it was that I was doing. I couldn't do it that way anymore. It had kind of run its course. I found myself at a perfect place at the perfect time. It allowed me to practice law straight out of law school, make a little bit of a living, help a lot of people, or so I hope. And then I decided it really wasn't a way to continue to practice. I needed to find myself a job in the city or with someone that I could trust to merge my firm with or work with. And so the story then goes on from there. And it's really more of a networking story than it is anything else. So maybe we'll talk about that in the next segment.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah. Those years, that was around the same time I started my business. And I remembered like 05, 06, 07. I mean, we had more work than we can even handle. And then overnight, just the phone stopped ringing and just all sorts of bad situations. Yeah, it was crazy times in the real estate game.
Right. So Jay, what is Zimner Law now? What do you guys focus on primarily?
Yeah, so the litigation part of my practice over the years has somewhat slowed down for a number of different reasons, which we don't have to go into here. But a part of my networking, which Dom is a part of the community that I pride myself being a part of, which is a business networking international group here in the city, Chapter 1, which has basically raised me from being a pup into the dog that I am today. And I found myself acting in the capacity of litigator when I first started back in May of 2008, at the urging of a gentleman who came into my life in 2006 when I was scrambling to figure out ways to actually practice law and legitimately find ways to practice in a way that would provide me for long-term success, which was a gentleman by the name of Neil Dobshinsky, who is like the Wizard of Oz. He's a walking encyclopedia of law. He's the exact perfect match for a guy like me who's willing to go out there, meet a bunch of people, and try to help solve problems. But he was really the mastermind behind my ability to go out there. And so he had urged me, Jay, you really need to get into networking. And I've got the perfect group for you, which is this Chapter 1 that I alluded to, which had a number of wonderful professional people who were like-minded and really after the same goal. Try to give as much as you can to your fellow professional, and ultimately what goes around comes around. Givers gain, as they say. And so he linked me up with a guy, Larry Sharp, who at the time was a sales consultant, who has now gone on to run for governor of New York on the Libertarian ticket. You guys can look him up. Larry Sharp, a fascinating guy who's done very well for himself. He kind of took me under his wing and said, Jay, I've got the place for you, which was at Morton's Steakhouse, Wednesday mornings at 7 a.m. And I'm 31 years old and thinking to myself, I'm not going anywhere at 7 a.m. I'm busy watching SportsCenter on loop at 7 a.m. I'm not getting out of bed. Well, I also said to myself, Jay, you started your own business, your own practice out of law school. You can't just be laying around watching SportsCenter in the morning. You better get yourself out of bed and get up before everybody else. And that's where the real pros and the real success happens. When everyone else is sleeping and not focusing on their business is when you can be, and you'll excel. So I listened to the wise, sage advice of Neil and Larry and showed up to this meeting at 7 a.m. and it changed my life forever. Without them, I don't know what I would be. But ultimately, I went in as the general practitioner. Then I was the litigator. And then the real estate attorney vacated his seat. And it's a non-compete group, so there couldn't be two real estate attorneys. And I continuously got tapped on the shoulder. Hey, Jay, do you practice real estate law? And I said, no, I'm a litigator. And then I get another tap. Hey, Jay, do you practice real estate law? And I'd say, no, but I've got a great person that I can introduce you to. And it happened again and again and again. And I'm like, wait a minute. I'm giving up way too much work. I got to figure out what this real estate thing is all about. And if it's too heady and I can't figure it out, then that's okay. I'll stick with the litigation. But I soon realized that real estate can be voluminous if you're doing it right, which is really the only way for lawyers that practice residential real estate transactional work can make a living, is to know a lot of real estate agents who are willing to trust you with their clients and with their transactions. And of course, real estate agents want to make sure that their deals get done and done successfully. And again, I pride myself on helping those clients and those agents get their deals done, get them over the finish line, and get them closed. But it was because of this group sort of constantly nudging me, hey, Jay, do you do real estate law? That it forced me to kind of figure out what the practice of real estate law was all about. And for the last, 13, 14 years, that's primarily what I've been focusing on. And litigation has taken more and more of a backdrop to the real estate practice.
Would you say that you guys, what is your perfect referral, what you specialize in now? Are you guys doing high-end condos, co-ops? Are you doing, are you doing any commercial stuff? Where do you want to be at? Is there a price point of real estate you want to be involved in?
Those are really great questions. I don't really care if somebody's buying a studio in the Bronx for $198,000 or they're buying a condo in a high rise in the middle of Manhattan for $90 million. I can handle both transactions. They both require usually the same amount of work. There's just more zeros at the end of both price tags. And it really doesn't change the focus or the kind of care that I provide my clients. I get paid a flat fee. Generally speaking, when I'm dealing, I've never dealt with a $90 million transaction. The biggest deal I've ever done was around $9 or $10 million. And we can get into that in just a little bit if you'd like to. But ultimately, I have a slight sliding scale. My flat fee is around $3,500 to represent buyers and sellers of co-ops and condos, and even single family homes if they have brownstones. But generally speaking, brownstones are at a higher price point. So I find myself really more around $4,500, $5,000. For really, really large scale deals, I think the $10 million deal ended up being around $8,500, $10,000, because there's more risk to me as a lawyer. And so I have to adjust my fee to account for that greater risk. But ultimately, the same number of hours are spent. I care just as much about that first-time buyer who's just getting their feet wet in the market and are very concerned about what it means to own and live in a building, whether it be shares in a cooperative or real estate in a condominium or in a single-family home. And so the due diligence differs a little bit, and my negotiation might differ slightly, but ultimately the same type of practice, the same type of focus goes into each of my deals.
Now, you doing title work as well, or is that something you partner with somebody outside for?
Yeah, no, we've got a really good guy at Chapter One who I'll name drop, Roy Fanichel with Newmark. He's excellent. He provides really, really wonderful title services. There are other companies that I've worked with who are extremely helpful. I can't imagine a life of a real estate attorney without the help of title companies and the kind of work that they do and the searches that they do. And with that, I can do my job for the the fee that I charge. Otherwise, I tell my clients if they don't want title insurance, then I'm going to charge them the amount that the title insurance would cost to do all the searches that they're going to do anyway. Because there's no way I'm going to take that kind of chance.
Right. So we had talked about this a little bit offline before, and I'm very curious as somebody that's been doing real estate transactions specifically over the years, kind of the trends that you've seen, from probably the onset of COVID and then where we are now. Between people leaving the city, or maybe there's other people that are coming to the city. I'm very curious to see you on the legal side, like kind of the trends that you've been seeing. I think that's really interesting.
My experience was, I don't think unique at all. I think a lot of us, Rob, you included, Dom, probably you to some extent, or maybe not, but we can talk about that. During the pandemic, after people got comfortable with the fact that we were probably in for the long haul, made some pretty big decisions that they weren't willing to make pre-pandemic. And what do I mean specifically by that? Rob had asked, or Dominic had asked me, Jay, how were things during the pandemic? Expecting me to say, things were really dire, because for a lot of people in a lot of professions, things got very quiet and got very scary. And there was no way to assure oneself that their job was going to be there at the end of the pandemic. For those that were...
and Jay, not to interrupt you, and a lot of people were leaving the city.
Well, yeah, and that's what I'm going to get to in just a second, because that was really a cause for that perfect storm that we talked about offline. But ultimately, people that were in mental health or real estate found themselves doing really, really well and very, very busy. And other people were wondering, what they were going to do with the rest of their lives. So speaking of making big decisions and wondering what was going to happen with the rest of their lives, a lot of people got scared out of the city. And they thought probably temporarily. They moved their families away because schools closed. People didn't know whether it was safe to live in buildings, be in elevators. People were wearing masks, told not to even touch their mail, right? We weren't even allowed to open our mail because it could be contaminated with this crazy virus that came from China that could kill us all. And so it was understood that was the information we were giving. And a lot of people, naturally being protective, took their families, as did I, out of the city. So there was more space, right? We could live and breathe the air. We could find our little communities, what they call them, little bubble shelter. What do they call the friend groups that you could have during?
I don't know.
What do they call them, Al? Pods. You had your little pods, right? So we were living out of the city as well, as were a number of other families. And so it started to really force people into a sort of a changed mindset, in my opinion. People were then starting to look at life very differently. What was more important? Living the fast life of the city in smaller spaces, living fast-paced life and having easier time getting to the office and having no commute? Or was it better to live a more relaxed life with more space, a green lawn, away from people, maybe not commuting to the city as often? This started to feel really nice for a lot of people. Doing things remotely, doing things via Zoom, communicating via Zoom, right? People took a different sort of stance with regard to their daily life. And what I found happened in real estate, and this is just me sort of pontificating and hypothesizing, I don't know if this is necessarily the case, but a lot of what we saw was really emotional and psychological. There were a number of people who were probably on the fence about moving out of the city for years and years and years, with their families growing and getting larger and having less and less space, but never really felt comfortable pulling the trigger and leaving, because change is hard for people. Unless you're forced to change. So these people then all of a sudden were forced to change because of health fears. They moved out of the city and then realized, maybe I don't want to go back. So these condos and co-ops that people owned in Manhattan and Brooklyn, those were the neighborhoods and the boroughs that I was dealing in primarily. Those people decided they were leaving, and they wanted to leave quickly. They wanted to buy something in the suburbs, whether it be upstate, Florida, which I guess I'll consider a suburb of New York for now, or they went to Long Island or New Jersey. You had a ton of people who wanted to leave the city. And then you had a lot of other people who had been sitting on the sideline for a number of years, not knowing when they'd have the right opportunity to buy something at the right price. And what I mean by perfect storm is you had a number of people who were not scared off by the virus and saw this as an opportunity to buy. You saw a lot of people who were forced out of the city and made that decision that that was more comfortable for them in their future. And so you had people who desperately wanted to buy and all this inventory to buy, and the government kept interest rates very, very low. So it was almost free to borrow money. And so there was this huge influx of transactions happening, people getting out of the city, people desperately wanting to sell. Prices came down ever so slightly to match that. And you had people that were borrowing money at low interest rates, and they were able to borrow more and buy more. And it was happening like nonstop. So I went from maybe 10 deals a month, 8 to 10 deals a month, to 8 to 10 deals a week.
Wow.
That's how busy we got. And I ended up hiring an attorney from your neck of the woods, Dom, and she's still with me today, Jennifer Cesarano, and she's been wonderful, and she's still with me today. And we're starting to get a little bit busier again, because for 18 months, it was the best time of my professional career. And then the 18 months thereafter were the worst.
Yeah.
18 months of my career.
And
So-
is that strictly interest rate driven?
I think so. Yeah. So the government during the pandemic, as you both know, gave away a lot of free money. I was the recipient of some of that free money as well. And I was happy to take it. The advice that my accountant gave me is, the government's giving you money, take it. Everybody's taking it. There were people who didn't need the money who took it. There were some people in the news who decided to forego it, and they made the news because they were foregoing it. They were an outlier, right? That was very rare. The very, very, very wealthy people took millions and millions and millions of dollars. Well, what happens when there's lots of dollars in the system? It becomes less valuable. So what do we have? Inflation or inflationary concerns. So the government then says, whoa. We're not going to let all these dollars floating out there higher the cost of a loaf of bread or, fruit or whatever it is. Prices kept going up and up and up because retailers, wholesalers, people in business realized they could grab more dollars because there were more available. And I'm not an economist. I don't pretend to be. I'm not an accountant, so don't worry. But my sense of what inflation is exactly that. So the government has to rein that in so that we don't get these polarizing effects where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. You've got to try to keep things as middle as possible so that we don't have some crazy happening as a result. And so you raise interest rates in order to slow the markets down, to reclaim control over the dollar, and so on and so forth. And so when it's more expensive to borrow money, I always said to my clients and to anyone that would listen that the prices would have to come down for New York apartments. But nobody wanted to sell their apartment for less because they had just been hearing stories about record highs and everybody's selling for millions of dollars and grabbing all that equity and moving elsewhere. And now they didn't have that opportunity anymore. It was like the dog and the bone story. And so because they lost that opportunity, they weren't willing to lower the prices. And so with interest rates going up and no adjustment in the market for pricing, you get stagnation and then nothing happens. Buyers sit on the sideline, sellers sit on the sideline, and nothing happens. At least in New York. I don't know about the rest of the country, but that's at least what I was seeing.
That's a trend that I'm seeing in my business even now. It's exactly what's happening. Just everybody's
terrible
on the sidelines.
Yeah.
Jay, I had a question for the people that maybe live in the suburbs of New York and they're considering moving into the city or buying a condo or co-op as opposed to like a private detached home. What are some of the pros and cons with those? Obviously, there's a different sequence of transactions, right? You're now dealing with a condo board that has to approve you or a co-op board. I mean, I've been involved in some cases where the board actually declined the person applying for, a plethora of reasons. So, what are some pros and cons or some complications can someone expect maybe selling their private home and then going into a co-op or a condo?
You're right. There are pros and cons. If you're coming from the suburbs, I don't know if you consider like Staten Island a suburb because I've seen your home. And as far as the way you live in Staten Island, that is a suburb as far as I'm concerned. That's not a city guy. So if anybody's willing to leave that, I don't know what's wrong with you. I'm going to check you into a mental institution. But if you are living in a single family home elsewhere in a suburb outside of the city and you're choosing or wanting to live in the city in a building, the pros and cons are you're dealing with other people rather than just yourself. That's as simple a way as I can put it. If you're buying in a co-op, you're going to find that prices are less than in condos. And the reason why is there's a stricter nature in a co-op than there is in a condo. Condos tend to be more freely exercisable, if I can use that term. You can sell freely. There is board approval that's required, but it's a waiver of right of first refusal, which we can talk about in just a second. But in a co-op, there are strict regulations on whether or not you can sublease your space, how long it takes for you to be able to do so, how much it's going to cost you to live in that building, what are your responsibilities and shared responsibilities with other shareholders in the building, who gets to decide who you sell to if you should go to sell, what are the taxes, meaning the flip tax you're going to owe the building when you leave, and there's all sorts of considerations when it comes to buying in a co-op. But you do find that co-op prices per square foot are less as a result. So if you can live within their rules and their restrictions and their requirements, then maybe you can find a happy fit. And plenty of people do. I sell more co-ops than I do anything else, or help people buy and sell co-ops more than any other type of property in the city. Condos give you greater flexibility in that you own real estate. You get a deed to the property, it's title rather than shares. It gets recorded. You own the four corners of your wall of your apartment. You're responsible for the fixes in your apartment just as you would in a single family home. It doesn't require permission unless you're making major alterations, which Dom, you could probably speak to more so than I. But aside from the board being concerned about you knocking down a Manhattan building, they're going to let you do as you please with your apartment, including renting it to somebody else. So pros and cons. Pros, there's a greater sharing of responsibility when you live in a building with other people. So that generally makes the cost for things lower. But the con is you're required to follow the rules and live with a lot of other people, and possibly noise from upstairs, or somebody overflows a bathtub and it leaks into your apartment, and now you have a leak in your apartment that's causing damage to your furniture and your rugs. Right. So things like that.
Okay.
You also have the maintenance charges. I mean, real estate taxes obviously are across the board, but some of these maintenance charges, doormen, things like that, become very expensive. I mean, I've seen some of these monthly charges that are very significant.
They can be. And, boards play with their maintenance and common charges all the time to make themselves either more or less desirable to the open market. And oftentimes there's great consideration for appealing to people who might want to buy into the building, whether it be a condo or a co-op. You mentioned real estate taxes. In a co-op, the building is paying real estate tax, not the individual shareholders. Now, they are, of course, paying into the real estate tax that's owed by the co-op because they're owners in that building, and a part of their maintenance is going towards that. But it is a building that's paying real estate taxes with all of the shareholders paying into that. I don't know if that would reduce the amount of real estate tax one pays. I have to assume it does. One, New York City real estate taxes are generally lower than in Westchester or in other communities. And you're also dealing with a greater amount of square footage or land that you're paying real estate tax on outside of the city than you are in the city. So in the tax discussion, usually you're getting a better deal in the city than you are elsewhere, but you're also getting far less space to the city.
So that's very true. That's a good point. Speaking of that, because now I'm thinking of a lot of things here. So what are some of the risk factors that you as an attorney are constantly looking for when you get contracts over? And are there, do co-ops require a lot more contract review than condos or vice versa? I'm curious what you see in that side of things.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And as I mentioned kind of before, my job for the person who's buying a $90 million condo on Central Park South, or a client who's buying their first co-op apartment up in the Bronx, is pretty much the same. I'm going to ask for four main things. I want to see the financials of the building. I want to see the minutes, which are the meeting notes that the board keeps when they meet and what they're discussing. I'm going to have my custom questionnaire filled out by a manager or a board member who has the answers to those questions, which I can get into just in just a little bit. And I want to know that the building is operating in such a way where they're taking care of capital improvements, they're keeping up with local laws, and so on and so forth. And I gather that information while I'm simultaneously negotiating the legal terms of their contract. I tell my real estate agents all the time, I don't want to meddle with the business terms. They've already done that for me, for their client, not for me. Although the better the real estate agent at negotiating the business terms, the easier my job gets. So with that being said, real estate agents will provide us attorneys with a deal sheet. It's like a deal memorandum with all of the business terms and the contact information that's important with regard to the deal. Those are used to memorialize terms into a contract, which is generated by the sales side. The seller's attorney will send to the buyer's attorney that contract to review and comment on. And while we're waiting on that review, I'm starting to go through the financials, the history of the building, reviewing minutes, trying to connect the dots between what's being said in those meetings to what I'm actually seeing in the financials or what I'm seeing on my custom questionnaire. Now, my custom questionnaire has 3 pages of questions. It asks, what is the building considering doing? Capital improvements, how are they going to pay for them? Are there any assessments currently happening? What is the amount of that assessment? Are there any planned future assessments that are upcoming to pay for some sort of a capital improvement? Are there any issues in the building? Are there lawsuits in the building? Are there complaints about noise or rodents or things that would be, uncomfortable to a client to want to consider buying into? I'm looking at all sorts of different things just to try to help my client make the best decision possible. I'm not trying to make decisions for my clients. A lot of them have an agenda and they already feel very comfortable about what they've made an offer on and what's been accepted. It's just really an eyes widening experience, an eye opening experience to know. So I want them to know what the financial history looks like and how the building is operating and what they're focused on so that they don't buy into a money trap. They could find themselves seeing things on, in the listing that say maintenance is this and the cost of this is that. But truth be told, it's going to go up by 10% next year, and they've got a major capital improvement lined up. And maybe that's one of the reasons why the seller decided to sell before they got trapped in that. So I just want my clients to know that.
A lot of times tax abatements as well. Tax abatements are ending and the building's huge increases in tax.
Absolutely.
Jay, you've been in business a long time. You're in the city. You're definitely in great circles. I'm sure you have some interesting stories about, deals along the way. Something that stands out. Maybe it was a funny story or a sad story or something completely outrageous. I know you've worked with people, professional athletes and people in show business. Can you share, maybe 1, 2, 3 short stories about, things that stand out in your career, representing people buying and selling real estate in the city?
Yeah, absolutely. One story always comes to mind. And it was because I was much younger and the kind of dollars that I was dealing in was somewhat exceptional to me at the time. I guess it would be exceptional to me now as well. But ultimately, I was living in the East Village. I'll tell a little bit more of the story. I was living in the East Village at the time, 6th Street and Avenue A. And I spent a lot of time in Tompkins Square Park playing gin rummy with a bunch of 80-year-olds around a chess table while the homeless people listened to their music or got into the occasional fight, or there was the drug deal happening just, behind me. But we all didn't pay attention. We called it the living room. We were one big happy family. And there was this guy who came up to me, this guy named Ron, who always had a basketball in his hands. And he goes, I have this friend who's living in a loft apartment in Chelsea. Do you think you could help her? I go, I might be able to help her if you had some more information for me. I mean, her living in Chelsea in a loft doesn't really help me much. So he's like, all right, come over here with me. And he told me a little bit about the story, how there was this young developer who was coming in to buy this building and started to, quote unquote, harass her about her apartment. I hadn't really dealt much with this, but I very quickly got wise to it. What he was referring to is what was common back in those days as surrender agreements, where people that had long-term leases or even short-term leases would sell those leases back to landlords or developers who would then go into rent-stabilized or rent-controlled apartments or low-cost apartments, get rid of the tenant who was basically getting in the way of their ability to increase rent. They would remove that tenant, and then they would go in and do capital improvements, which allowed them to then increase the rent, and they would get much more, and they would recover whatever they paid that person to leave, very, very quickly and find that their building was more valuable. They could borrow against the building at a higher rate, all sorts of things that developers were thinking, which I wasn't thinking about tenants or landlords in any such way until this came across my desk. So I said, let me see if I can help this woman. So this woman then starts to tell me her story about how her husband had been there for 40 years, had used it as an art studio, as an art loft. She was paying like a few $100s a month, like $800 for a huge, massive, like 1,800 square foot space. And that she had become friends with a couple of other renters in the building as well. So I said, let me, introduce me. So she introduces me to these 3 different apartment renters, and we formed a group. And this developer came in and bought the building and said, Jay, I understand you represent apartment A, apartment B, and apartment C. I'd love to buy your clients out. I go, that's great. What are you offering? So we started with some really low ball price. And I said, my clients, first of all, are not leaving without a significant amount of money, because now you're removing them from an apartment that's very valuable to them because it's affordable. They're going to have to leave the city now. And at some point, that money you're offering them is going to be gone. And then what are they going to do? Because these weren't people with substantial professional careers or jobs. They were either older or in lower income jobs that allowed them to live in these apartments and so on and so forth. So I said, we're not leaving for less than $2 million. And so we went from like a couple $100,000, so like $75,000 per family, now up to $650,000 per family. And so we negotiated from a $2 million platform rather than his $200,000, and we ended up at $1.5 million. The clients paid me on contingency, so I almost felt like a personal injury lawyer. I was actually dealing with real money. My clients were thrilled. They had enough money to move elsewhere. They've been very happy ever since. They were able to find affordable housing. They still have money to live on. Fortunately, they're both working. The older woman, who was my initial introduction through Ron in Tompkins Square Park, playing gym rummy with my 80-year-old friends, started this whole thing, my first major referral of significant kind. And it enabled me to earn my first very large fee in the city by doing a surrender.
That's very cool.
It was really just capitalizing on what I was able to research and determine was the value to the developer and what they were really truly willing to pay for those 3 spaces in that building. Now, I understand that's not even available anymore. I'm not doing any lease terminations or surrenders anymore because landlords are now, and Dominic, you could probably talk of this, are not able to increase rents like they used to be. So there's no incentive to buy anybody out anymore, because you buy someone out, you're going to lose that money. There's no way to recover it, because even if you do the capital improvements, you can't increase the rent.
Right. That's right. Yeah. It's a long process to remove those rent stabilization and rent control laws against those particular buildings. I'm sure you. I know you have run into a bunch of like celebrity or athlete type clients.
Yeah.
But my understanding is the athletic type client is more transitional to the city. They get traded to a team, they might play for a few years and then they leave, or play even for 1 year and then leave. Even in the building we live in, we've had some professional basketball players that live there, or football players that live there. You see them 1 year and then they're gone the next. Have you run in a lot of those circles, and what's your opinion about like people coming in and leaving, like this transient community here in the city?
It's interesting that you put it that way. I don't know how I'm going to avoid going into any sort of detail that could potentially get me in trouble, but only because I like to protect my clients' names. But ultimately, there was a player recently who was traded. I won't use the name. But we had just done a transaction where he purchased for the first time in the city. He had been renting for a year and decided to purchase a place that I helped him with. And fortunately, he didn't have to go too far. And he's staying locally and not having to sell the apartment that he just purchased. So I texted him and I said, you owe me one, because had you been traded elsewhere, we would have been putting your place on the market. I would have had another transaction to do. And he just kind of laughed. But you're right. I think there's a lot of professional athletes who don't feel confidently about their long-term, the prognostication of them staying in one place for any great length of time for a professional athlete is not highly likely, unless they're a mega superstar and they feel like they control their own destiny. Most players don't have that kind of control. And again, the players that do have that kind of control, we're talking about like the 1% of the 1% of the 1%, right? So if you're representing any of those athletes that might find themselves in another city, some of them appreciate real estate as a business and as a way to invest. And they don't care if they have to turn around and sell it in 2 years. They feel like there's money to be made there rather than renting and sort of pissing away the money. And so they're advised to buy. And if they have to sell, they sell. So I guess it's really about who's advising the athlete and how confident they feel about where they're going to land and where they're going to stay and how long their career is going to be and how much money they intend to make. So I guess if you're one of those guys who was lucky enough to play in any of the 4 lovely leagues, NHL, MLB, NBA, or NFL, and you're one of those guys that's finding it hard to find any playing time or get some long-term deal, maybe it is better that you rent. But for a lot of these athletes who are making multiple millions of dollars and having local endorsement deals, they might want to buy whether they're here for any length of time or not. So yes, I've been lucky enough to represent a couple of high-profile players, athletes here in the city, as well as an Academy Award-winning actress who I'm still involved with in terms of her legal work and other things that may come up in her life. So I've had some fascinating clients who have trusted me, and it's always a privilege to be able to help anybody truly. Really, a celebrity status really makes no difference other than, again, they're unique in that they're very talented people who get paid a lot of money. But that's true of almost any profession, right? So
before we wrap up, I want to talk about the power of networking, right? Because, I mean, a huge part of this podcast today was talking about your life and where networking, and listen, Rob and I agree, and we're both huge networkers as well, where the power of networking is just, you can't put a price on it. I mean, look at your career just from this one group that we belong to, that you graciously invited me to. It sounds like that group alone probably makes up over half of your business. And I love this story. I overheard a story that you were sharing with Aaron Mazer, who also was a guest on our podcast.
Oh, nice.
And this is Rob. As a real estate guy, this is an interesting angle. They were watching the trade. I'm not going to say what sport it was, but they were watching the draft. And a guy, I think it was from Arizona, was drafted to New York.
Right now.
And Aaron Mazer, the real estate guy in the group, was like, "Hey, Jay, aren't you from Arizona? Do you know anybody over there?" And Jay's like, "I think I do." And they were able to get ahead of it where Jay, because he's from there, knew where the kid played, was able to get him, introduced him to Aaron because we knew he was coming, and Aaron put him into an apartment.
Really? And you did the legal work?
Yeah, so I'll
That's very
all right. So Dom, that was well said. I'll use some different terminology, but Aaron is absolutely correct in that we were lamenting the Kevin Durant trade. And I am a very emotional sports fan. I feel like I have some proprietary interest in all my sports teams, as I mentioned at the top of the podcast. I love my Suns, I love my Diamondbacks, and I love my Cardinals. I don't have my Coyotes anymore, but you know what? I'm not much of a hockey guy anyway. So when news came out that Kevin Durant had been traded to Phoenix, for some it was like, oh my God, that's going to put the team over the top. But we were losing some very valuable and some guys who meant a lot to a lot of people emotionally. And my kids were included in that emotion. They weren't sure whether they loved the trade or hated it. But I know that my older son, when he heard the news from his younger brother, began to cry. And I couldn't tell if they were tears of happiness or tears of sadness. And he goes, "Daddy, the one guy I didn't want to see go was Mikal Bridges." And I go, "I know, Cass, but to get something, you've got to give up something. I get it." So later in the day, I speak to Aaron Mazer almost daily, and we're talking about the trade. He was like, "No, it's great. How could you ever say otherwise?" Even Mikal Bridges came out in his press conference and said, "If I'm the GM of a team and someone was able to get Kevin Durant, I'm trading me too." So he was all for the trade, but it's always sad to see your favorite players go. In the meantime, Aaron was like, "Wait a minute, Jay, you're from Arizona. Like, you're connected, right?" I'm like, "You know what? I am connected to the Suns. I am connected to these teams. Let me make a couple of calls. So I called my first buddy from kindergarten, who, again, I'm very close with still. And I said, Eric, let's talk trade. And so we talked trade. And I knew that he was friendly with a lot of guys on the team. He actually does title work out in Arizona. And I was like, is there any way you could put me in touch with some of these guys' agents? Maybe I'd be able to put them in touch with a great real estate team here to help them. They're going to have to live somewhere. So I was like, of course. You're like my best friend from kindergarten. Of course. So he made some calls. And he's like, I've got one of my best friends out in New York who's willing to take care of these guys in their new city with any real estate question they had. And so ultimately I connected Aaron to the guys who had been traded for Kevin Durant. And
I love that.
The rest of the story was he ended up finding a rental, and then I represented him on the purchase.
I love it. That's a really
so
cool.
Rob, networking doesn't just happen here locally where you're trying to get the local builder or local developer, right?
Oh, of course.
When just like Jay, I'm always trying to meet new real estate agents and brokers as well. Yep. In the sports game, guys are moving around every season, and
for sure.
Nationally, if we have some connections, now Jay's my Arizona guy now, right? But it's powerful, and you just keep your eye on another niche, by the way. Like you looking up those civil cases of people being sued, that's a whole niche business where you identify people coming here. It's public information. Somehow get in touch with them and provide the education and the assistance they need. And if it turns into a project or a job or something that makes money, it's even better.
Well, don't give away all his tricks.
Exactly. But to Dom's point, there is sort of a thought that sort of goes through my head quite continuously, and it's the concept of the collection of people, right? You have the more people you have in your life that you're able to do right by or to do good for. In return, I think we're naturally wired to want to reciprocate and want to do good for that other person who's providing, right? So I'm always thinking like, how can I provide for someone? How can I help them? Not necessarily with the idea in mind that, it's going to come back to me.
Yeah, of course.
But inherently it does. It does. It just happens. It feels good to give. It feels good to help. It feels good to hear the story about how Dom or Rob's life was changed by that one phone call or that one person they met in high school or college or at a dinner or at a party or whatever. You're naturally going to be like, how do I thank that person? How do I go out of my way for them like they went out of their way for me? And that's really what it's about.
I really enjoyed this, Jay. This was a really great episode. Thank you for coming on. I hope we'll get you on again for some other segments. I'd actually love to do one maybe on like some local laws and some of the changes that are going on in Manhattan. So
sure.
Thank you so much for being here.
Guys, thank you so much. What a great platform. You guys are doing great work. And Rob, I look forward to getting to know you better. And
you as well.
Dominic, this is just one more epic phase of the friendship. So I really appreciate it, man.
And it's amazing. I'm going to be seeing this guy not only tomorrow at 7 a.m., but we also have a 1:30 lunch. It just shows you how quickly we become intertwined. So I'll see you tomorrow morning, 7 a.m., man. Thanks so much for coming on. This was great. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you both. I really appreciate it. Take care.